Well, thank you all so much for joining. I think I feel very blessed and also grateful and also humbled to come after such powerful speakers. I think it's a wonderful way to kind of talk about yoga and social change in remembering who came before us and the torch that we carry as yoga practitioners, teachers, scholars, and people out here doing this work. My name is Taina Rodriguez Berardi. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am leading this discussion or this workshop on yoga and social change. We've had to shorten it a little bit just because obviously our main event went a little over. So I'll try and go through as methodically, but also quickly as possible so that we can get a bulk of the idea behind this talk, but also get some participation and some communal exchange. I did have to cut a couple things out, but hopefully we can all stay in contact, stay in community, and follow up with each other. I'd love to start with a grounding practice to call in the space. I'll be reciting the pavamāna mantra as an embodied purification and unification practice of body, mind, spirit, a symbol of the endeavor to unify the individual, the collective, and the universal. The pavamāna mantra pavamāna meaning being purified or strained was historically recited in the name of Soma, a god in the Vedic traditions. So if you will, go ahead and settle into your space, become immersed in your grounding, maybe settle your feet into the earth. And if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. And start to focus on your breath. I'll recite the mantra 3 times. Feel free to join in verbally with the mind or in silence. And as you recognize the inhales and the exhales, let your body get nice and settled, released. Let's take a big breath together in through the nose. Open mouth, exhale. Om Masato Masat Gamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya Mirtyor Ma Mirtam Gamaya. Om Masato Masat Gamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya Mirtyor Ma Mirtam Gamaya. Om Masato Masat Gamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya Mirtyor Ma Mirtam Gamaya. From the unreal, Asat, lead me to the real, Sat. From darkness, lead me to light. From death, lead me to immortality. From evil, lead me to good. From darkness, lead me to light. From death, lead me to immortality. From falsehood, lead me to truth. From darkness, lead me to light. From death, lead me to immortality. I'd also like to take this moment to invoke a land acknowledgement in recognition of the Tongva people, past, present, and future, that are indigenous to the Los Angeles basin where LMU resides, where I live. I'm specifically in Long Beach near the sacred grounds of Pavanga, the meeting ground of different Tongva tribal communities where they convened for sharing of knowledge, goods, and traditions, just like we take part in today. So to me, this recognition within our collective speaks to the decolonization work that we must all do as practitioners of an indigenous cultural artifact of yoga. because throughout American history, communities have romanticized, especially Western communities, have romanticized Indian images, both Native American and Indic, especially in eras of alienation and crisis, like we're going through now with a global health pandemic, ongoing systemic oppression and racism that plagues our culture. We must also recognize the propensity as mostly white, affluent, educated practitioners and teachers to exoticize religious others, appropriate their traditions, and position ourselves as representative authorities that erase BIPOC origins. We must honor the people and tradition keepers of South Asia and India, the indigenous people of our lands that cultivated a practice that has transformed millions of people in itself over time, traveling great distances over oceans and seas, carried by people, oral and textual tradition, both shared and appropriated. It's here. I'll also call in my indigenous ancestors who taught me compassion, strength, and resilience, and call in all of our ancestors to help make space for generations of descendants after us. Today is about the inner work. We're all aware of the benefits of the outer work, the prana, the meditation, the asana, but today we go deep within, hearing our Dharma calling us individually and collectively, for unless we are all free, no one is free. So let us strive for liberation or moksha or nirvana or mukti, kaivalya, samadhi, whatever the word is that resonates with you. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. The universal sounds lay the foundation for us in peace. So take a moment to reconnect with your breath. Several rounds as you blink your eyes open. Reacclimate yourself to the room, the colors, the shapes, the movement of your surroundings. And as you do so, I want to recognize that Indigenous land acknowledgement starts with self-reflection. And the reason I do this land acknowledgement is or this Indigenous acknowledgement is because I ask myself often, how am I leaving Indigenous people in a stronger, more empowered place? How have I appropriated Native American or Indic culture without acknowledging or naming, knowing influences or sources? So it really starts with that self-reflection. Indigenous people are not in the past only, they are present and our future. They're not relics. So we need to learn and create, collaborate, and highlight our Indigenous siblings and compensate fairly, because often Indigenous people are asked to perform emotional and physical academic labor for free. And knowing that there is work to be done, land acknowledgement alone is not enough. It's merely a starting point. So supporting organizations by donating your time or money, supporting Indigenous-led grassroots change movements and campaigns, that's all part of a yoga practice, a yoga lifestyle, coming in solidarity, committing to sovereignty, and not abusing their medicine. So it's for me an important aspect of remembering to do the homework, know the history, know your history of the land, of the people, of pronunciations, and even reflecting on your own history and ancestral roots, because oftentimes, like I mentioned, we have a tendency to shy away from learning our own, yet we are more than willing to appropriate or dive into someone else's culture before even recognizing our own propensity to deflect our own. And so a moment of reflection or even journaling, and even if someone has something they'd like to drop into the chat in response, but how have you contemplated your own ancestral roots or cultural traditions? And how, even further, are you learning about or exploring those roots and traditions? So if you want to take a moment and reflect and recognize. And just as a brief introduction, I'd love to have much more than an hour with you all, but this is just the beginning. I am a graduate student of the Yoga Studies Master's degree program at Loyola Marymount. I finished my program earlier this year, 2021, and my research was really focused on critical yoga studies at the intersection of modern yoga and transformative justice communities. So really yoga and social change, the history of modern yoga, and how we come as practitioners to engage this practice is part of the 2-year process of what I've been diving into and doing research and even conducting studies in the field. I'd also like to, as well as my ancestors and the landholders, but my teachers, my family, Jivana Heyman from Accessible Yoga, Michelle Johnson, Skill in Action, Susanna Barkataki, and all of my professors at LMU, Dr. Miller, Dr. Tiermeyer, Dr. Chappell, Dr. Fazio, and Dr. Payne in the therapy in the extensions program have all been integral to my studies. And even more so, I'd love if we could continue to share in community in the chat, if you feel so called, just saying hello, where you're from, where you call home, maybe if you know or are curious about the Indigenous land that you may occupy. If you know that would be great to share. And even your pronouns. I think a note on pronouns is that they're important for everyone to use regardless of gender identity. And with everyone using pronouns, it creates a safer space for all. A great resource is mypronouns.org, where you can really get a good foothold on how to teach all ages about the use of pronouns. So I appreciate you sharing. Thank you, Alaire. I hope I'm saying your name right. For sharing, and Teresia, welcome from Florida. Thank you all for participating. I think it's always better when we do it as community. So I really embrace you all out there in Zoom being able to connect us even though we're far apart. So today we talk about yoga and social change. And hello, Francesca from Ojai. How are you? We're talking about yoga's power in social change making. And I define social justice change making sacred spaces as operating on shared values of breaking down divisive barriers and challenging our limiting beliefs about intersectional identities such as ability, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, body image, and criminal background. And I see this as part of each of our individual dharmic paths, because the spiritual path begins with this recognition that all separation is suffering. And I used to have a really hard time with this word suffering because I thought it meant for human extremes of suffering. And I realized that this is not the case necessarily. We're all suffering in some respect. And this realization is what yoga for me is all about. And to continue that realization, can someone please go ahead and mute themselves? It's reverberating. Thank you so much. Or can the host mute them? Thank you. So this suffering and acknowledgement of it, it's really the realization that knowledge is the catalyst for action. And through action, human creative power transform the world within and around us. So embracing the cycle of suffering, knowledge, action, and transformation, or in a macro way, really talking about the cycle of samsara or rebirth, is the key to driving both personal and communal social change. So for me, yoga is less about a self-care package or practice and more about how we expand our awareness from individual to social collective liberation, and why and how we should employ the teachings of yoga to do this really vital work. So with a concentration on education, advocacy, community building. Yoga and social change really incorporates yoga and social justice philosophies and practices as tools for personal growth and powerful instruments of communal transformation. There'll be lots of me talking today, and hopefully you ruminating and doing some critical thinking, but I'm not here to literally spell things out for you. I see my job as an educator to bring to light and knowledge, or bring light and knowledge to the forefront. And your job as a practitioner or fellow teacher to access your current situation, status, identity, and apply the learnings that myself and many others, especially today, have facilitated to help make change in each and every one of our communities, to make that transformation, that action. And thank you everyone for continuing. Hi, Indu and Karen. Welcome from the Kodiak Islands of Alaska. Wonderful. So since we're all in so many disparate places, I like to start really from the basics. When I say modern yoga or even yoga, what mental image or visualization comes to mind? Maybe you jot this down in your journal or drop it in chat. There are really no wrong answers. It's more of a reflection on what image or imagery or words or sentiments come to mind when I ask you what is modern yoga, or define modern yoga. So I'll give you a moment and I'll take a sip of my tea. Yes. So just like Alaire, I also think of asana or postures, poses. And for me, even though I've been practicing yoga for many years, more than 15, I think, as a practitioner, and I've been teaching yoga since about 2013. I teach lots of different aspects, styles of yoga, especially as a brown, fuller bodied woman. For me, it's interesting. I quickly jump to something like this image right here, the quintessential modern yoga industrial complex, a brick and mortar studio, $20 to $40 fitness oriented asana classes, really flexible bodies, meditation minds on rubber mats looking all blissed out, right? Am I wrong? What did you all picture? So Yoga Journal and Yoga Lines conduct a survey about every 4 years. And in 2016, which is the most recent, they found that more than 36 million Americans practice yoga. 90% are aware of yoga, 1/3 have tried yoga, and more than 16 billion in reported consumer spending in 2016 can be attributed to yoga-related categories. Yoga is widely touted for its universal applications in physical, mental, and spiritual embodiment benefits. But this prevailing industry model that many of us picture and think of has really been shown to advance an exclusionary identity, one that standardizes the young, thin, white, expensive fitness appareled body, and subsequently really omits the individual outside, or the identity outside of that normative race, gender, sexuality, ability, and social class identity. And under this guise of free market access to spiritual and personal development and total well-being, most of yoga available today is provided by entrepreneurial endeavors, private equity firms, firm-backed corporate chains, or mega box fitness centers. And this growth has really meant that this commercial growth has really meant that yoga is available in more places and to more people than ever before, and in most major US cities and suburban spaces. But these offerings create the appearance that yoga is ubiquitous and practiced widely. And yet there are large segments of the population that are not found in these spaces, and many people who feel marginalized by practices that don't reflect their diverse needs and identities. And, I'm sure that we've all heard yoga is touted for its physical, mental, spiritual embodiment benefits, but this modern industry is exclusive in the physical, mental, and spiritual bodies that it caters to and also omits. Earlier, we had Marcel Haddix on a panel, and in one of her essays in the book, Yoga, the Body and Embodied Social Change, she writes, would-be yoga students, Black feminists, the LGBTQ community, full-bodied and fat folks, people with health issues and disabilities, and many others who don't fit the predominant model have literally and figuratively been turned away from places where teaching yoga is suggested as universal and practiced as means to achieve freedom from experiencing of suffering. So this modern yoga industry model has us think that yoga is stepping on a mat to find personal transformation. And while that might be something that we've all experienced or endeavor to experience, this truly falls short of universal liberation that all of us can experience. So how can yoga be both universal and exclusionary? And where does this industry standard come from? To take it a step further or go all the way back, what is yoga and how do we really define it? So what is yoga is like one of those quintessential questions that has a million answers. And we took an aspect of it earlier with thinking about what modern yoga is. So when defining yoga, is it stretching and breathing? Is it a religious practice? Is it a system of ethics and morals, freedom from suffering? To answer this would take I have a 2-year graduate degree in yoga studies, and I still am contemplating the answer to this question. But really, it offers an opportunity for us to reflect on the history of yoga. And two of my favorite quotes about thinking about our history, one from Michael Crichton: if you don't know your history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it is part of a tree. That's kind of how I think about yoga practitioners who have yet to embrace acknowledgement or an education on the history of yoga's origins, traditions, and history. And even more so, one of my favorite writers, poets, Maya Angelou, the more you know of your history, the more liberated you are. And yoga being a technology for liberation and transformation, that speaks so deeply to me. So from its very root, yoga is a Sanskrit term that comes from a root to bind, harness, connect, concentrate. Thank you. Shout out to Karen in the chat here, who was our Sanskrit teacher for 2 full years. And I still feel I'm at the very beginning, but it is a cognate with the English word yoke. And to put it even further, you see this little image of a dictionary, the Monier-Williams dictionary definition of yoga, and it's like several columns deep. And David Gordon White writes in his 2011 book, Yoga in Practice, when seeking to define a tradition, it's useful to begin by defining one's terms, like yoga. And it is here that problems arise. Yoga has a wider range of meaning than nearly any other word in the Sanskrit lexicon. The act of yoking an animal, as well as the constellation, is called yoga. When one mixes together various substances, hard word, that too can be called yoga. The word yoga has been employed to denote a device, a recipe, a method, a strategy, a charm, an incantation, a fraud, a trick, an endeavor, a combination, a union, an arrangement, zeal, care, diligence, industriousness, discipline, use, application, contact, a sum total, and the work of alchemists. But this is by no means an exhaustive list. And even more so, when we talk about yoga, are we talking about a state of being, a goal, or even a discipline or a practice? And, in each text that you look at, even just each Sanskrit text, because there are many yoga texts in many different languages, but just looking at 4 different yoga texts, you see that each of the definitions speaks to a different yoga as defined as either a state or a goal or a discipline or a practice. So deeper yet in the etymological aspects of yoga, we see early definitions of Sanskrit texts that yoga is both, right? Is described as a discipline, is described as a practice, but also a goal that one should attain. So when thinking about this history of yoga as an act of transformative social change, I like to start at kind of the beginnings. And typically I would do I facilitate yoga teacher trainings at the 200 and 300 hour level, where I go through a huge history of yoga as it relates to social change. And remember, through action, human creative power transforms the world within and around us. So it's always been a practice of action, and a reminder that yoga has always had underpinnings of social transformation and social change in the way its practitioners harness its positive and more liberating practices and traditions. Now, the goal of this section, and this is the part where I had to cut a lot out, this could be a year-long course, it could be several semesters, it could be a 6-hour training. So I'll go through history, quote unquote, briefly, but really the goal is that to impart that yoga has always been multifaceted and pluralistic in origin, practice, and influence. There's really no single tradition or religion that can claim yoga. It's pre-political or geographical state lines. So its origins are in South Asia, but its origins come at a time when, this was before we had lines in the sand denoting Pakistan or India or Afghanistan or beyond. And historically, yoga was practiced for spiritual, religious, and secular worldly aims. It was practiced to attain enlightenment, devotion to gods, but also for physical and health benefits. So understanding historically the ways in which yoga has been depicted, it helps us think about what yoga is today. And really, if you could take just one thing from this conversation, is thinking critically about much of the lore behind yogic traditions that have passed down through colonialist mindset, interpretation, and writings. A lot of the material that we study is from the white Western lens, particularly gained from the Western academic perspective, the male or patriarchal perspective, and ignores external sources from that quote unquote standard. So, who is telling the story and why? Who is left out? Basically, use your discerning yogic critique to understand the historiography of the modern tradition. And that would be, if you could take one thing away from this talk, I think it would be to know your sources, question your sources, etc. One thread that we see throughout yoga's development is that in its many forms, it is most always been about liberation, or it's been most always liberation oriented, liberation of the individual, and I would argue for the collective liberation as well. And this collective liberation takes many forms, from creating counterculture movements against Vedic ritual society to being utilized as a means of insurgency against oppressive colonizer governments and or counter movements away from the center at every point over thousands of years. For me, the reflection is often, how do we cultivate a modern yoga that is just as liberative? How does modern yoga support or contest the norms? How do we combat the tendency towards Orientalism, exoticism, romanticism, spiritual but not religious appropriative movements? I have a whole multi-part in-depth lecture on this history of modern yoga, like I said, that I facilitate. But today I'll just touch on a few aspects of the history as it reflects our theme today. The Indus Valley civilization, which is historically conjectured to be around 2600 to 1900 BCE, is oftentimes where we start having the conversation about foundations of yoga practice and traditions. And who out there has heard a modern yogaism that's touted in classrooms, I think all over, as saying, yoga is a 5,000-year-old lineage or 5,000-year-old tradition. I know I've heard it from the mouths of several, especially asana teachers. And I think this stems from a clay seal found in a clay seal that was found and misidentified from this time period. So along with the ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations, the Indus Valley civilization with a population of about 5 million at peak took place or was cultivated and created in this area. I don't know if you can see my cursor in, well, today the seal was found in, or I'm sorry, not today, but when it was, archaeologist John Marshall conducted a survey in this area and in the late 1920s and 30s and dug up this clay seal that you'll see here and equated it to a proto-Shiva icon of Vedic and Hindu worship. Now, this is highly problematic for several reasons. Foremost, that the evidence of or for depiction of this Hindu yogic or tantric practice is really dependent on reading later material evidence and practices with like an approximate 1,000-year gap between when this seal, this clay seal, was created and also the earliest textual evidence for a discipline called yoga. So there's nothing to say that there was not yogic-like or proto-yoga indigenous traditions being practiced during this time. We just don't have the material evidence to say so conclusively. I bring this up, this whole 5,000-year-old lineage linked to this finding of this clay seal as proof that yoga, that Virabhadrasana 2 or Warrior 2 or downward facing dog were practiced, or even seated postures were practiced at this time. It's just a reminder to recognize the sources that you ingest and where and why you're saying things as a teacher and or yoga practitioner. And, another aspect of the quote unquote brief history of yoga stems from the Vedas, a large body of religious texts originally written in Sanskrit and containing the first textual evidence of the word yoga. It's in the Upanishads and in the later Vedas, and then also the Shamanas, that we have the first evidence or mention of yogi-like practitioners. The word yoga is first mentioned in the Vedas, but not necessarily pertaining to the yoga that we practice today. In this later writings of the Upanishads and the Shamanas, we have this evidence or mentions of yoga-like practitioners convening at the margins of society as a counterculture movement away from Vedic sacrificial culture. They were questioning the sacrifice, questioning sacrificial normative culture, and questioning if there's something beyond the physical sacrifice to achieve immortality or liberation from the manifest world or manifest items. This reveals really a subtle critique of Vedic religion, society, ritualism, reveals a counterculture tradition at the margin of Vedic society that demonstrates a variety of ascetic renunciate groups that gathered in the forest, seeking for more individual or internal religiosity that challenged the norms of Brahmanical tradition. They wanted something more direct. Instead of having to pay a Brahmin to create the ritual, they wanted a direct bridge from the world to the spiritual, or they wrote of these or had these conversations. It was a reinterpreting and internalizing of the Vedic tradition. And rather than an external sacrifice of the fire, as you see here in one of these images, the fire became central to the body, and one sacrifices the breath to the fires, in an inner ceremony or sacrifice. And in these Upanishad Shramana texts, we have material example of largely male celibate ascetics who renounce Vedic society and head to the forests and mountains to contemplate and seek liberation from suffering through harnessing the body in a disciplined fashion, or tapas. During this time period, we have stories of the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, along his path, searching for the meaning of life and death and the quest for enlightenment. But he was part of this ascetic tradition, toiled with the shamans, practicing extreme feats of asceticism and self-mortification, like fasting, eating only one mustard grain per day, meditating all day, ignoring the needs of the physical body. Inevitably, he rejected this path and formed what is known colloquially as the middle path, or the middle way. But it's through this type of literature that we're able to contemplate a picture of ascetics who didn't necessarily call themselves yogis, or didn't say that they practice yoga, but were associated with early asceticism and attempts to use the body in a disciplined manner in order to cultivate power and transcend the limitations of the mind and body. In effect, yoking the mind and body with the senses. Now, skipping forward, like I said, this is just a snippet of areas or time periods or movements of social change facilitated by a yogic tradition. And I think we've all heard of the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And many people may have heard of the Mahabharata as well, which houses or is the larger text for which you find the Bhagavad Gita. But there's so much to say about these two texts. We've literally taken entire courses on them, if not multiple. But they're often touted, and the reason I bring them up today is they're often touted as the text, or the text of modern yoga. And they're revered as the classical representations of yoga philosophy and practice, most often the only text represented in teacher trainings. In fact, the Gita is the second most translated text in the world after the Bible. One thing of note, and why I bring this up, is these texts were originally translated into English and other languages and then disseminated worldwide because of a project of colonial Orientalism. Translation, not because of concern for spiritual truth, but for English or British use to understand Indian and South Asian culture to further their oppression and rule and governance. So these texts were translated to gain knowledge on the occupied culture in order to rule it better in shorter language. They were wanting to dominate and extract resources. They wanted to rule and occupy better. So instead of forcing South Asians or Indians to convert to Christianity, they wanted to understand their ways, and therefore were looking for a more, the most prolific text by which to learn about the culture. That is to say, there are reasons to read the Gita beyond acknowledgement that if you're reading it in German or English, this translation is, and this is why I have this image here, is that Charles Wilkins, the person who translated the Gita, he is a senior merchant in the service of the Honorable East India Company on their Bengal establishment. So as a tool of colonial rule. Others, the Gita is also important in its read of philosophy and culture. Many would read this text and say that it ultimately shows caste differences are sorry, I skipped ahead. So there's reasons to read the Gita as reinforcing the hierarchy of the caste system, is what I meant to say, and as a tool of the caste system that puts Brahmins on top and all others in a hierarchical, beneath them. Additionally, it's to say that it's necessarily, its language speaks to the karmic reasons for one to follow the rules or duty of their station in life, their dharma. Everyone is meant to perform karma based on their dharma, their qualities of materiality. So your social rank is inevitably the karma that you need to either burn off or to work towards. Others would read the same text and say it's ultimately not about caste differences and not important because it promotes an embodied in the world approach to spirituality, an engaged action in the world, ultimately introducing or making more widely popular devotional or bhakti devotional practices. The Gita, in effect, has made a connection with the divine more accessible. So while some might see the Gita as promoting the Varna caste system, others would recognize Bhakti's introduction to the masses through this text as an equalizer, more about one's inner intention. And even so, as we honor Gandhi today, in fact, he harnessed the Gita's teachings to instill national pride and thwart British occupation to inform his civic and political activism. He turned to the Gita as a symbol of the fight within oneself of good and evil and persevering. So another aspect of history that I find really interesting as it relates to yoga is building upon the earlier yogic and ascetic traditions and the tantras, really focusing on liberation through the material body, beginning with the emergence of hatha yoga, becoming more prominent in the cultural milieu of the Middle Ages. Many texts from this time frame have been studied and translated, and they seek to systemize and promote the emergence of yoga teachings and techniques. Here is where asana starts to emerge as means of bodily purification and therapeutics, to develop strength and freedom from disease and vitality. So it's to say largely male celibate ascetics focusing on cultivating tapas again, or physical and mental austerities for the attainment of boons or powers or immortality, physical strength, etc. This is, not necessarily a homogenous group of practitioners, though. This era really marks an emphasis on the yogic tantric body and the counterculture, again, further moving away from Brahmanical or Vedic tradition. And so during this time, you also see the beginnings of British occupation, British contact with this, the area of the Indian subcontinent. And throughout the history of colonization of the subcontinent, the Hatha yogins use their strong bodies and minds to fight back against colonization, creating militias and orders of ascetics with weaponry, and creating martial arts systems and practicing tapas for strength and mental conditioning. So ascetics by tradition led a nomadic and unattached lifestyle. So these ascetics just dedicated themselves to rebellion. These groups developed techniques for spying and targeting, and they adopted strategies of war against nobles in the occupying state. Then, unfortunately, the powers that be, colonization, British occupation, the British Raj, saw that these Hatha yogins caused major issues for their conquest, and subsequently warrior yogis were outlawed, Hatha austerities were outlawed. So by outlawing and rejecting Indian warriors, they were also rejecting Indian masculinity, individual economy, leading yogic Hatha yogins poor in strength and economic power, and really projected a less than positive, a savage perspective, a viewpoint of these practitioners throughout the Western world. So brief history, not covering the entirety or even getting us to modern times, but it just is a point of reflection. I think I leave you in this section to contemplate your understanding of the history of yoga. What are some of the yoga assumptions, myths, narratives that you can investigate further utilizing a critical lens? And who is telling the story? Who is left out? Jains, Buddhists, Tibetans critique the historiography of modern tradition, and really think about who it is that you're reading, who it is that you're cultivating your knowledge from. So I'll leave that as a thought that you might reflect upon or journal, and come back to. And I see someone says the slides have disappeared. Can you see the slides still?
I can still see them.
Beautiful, thank you. So, what is yoga? And is it all of those things plus more? What is your definition? And one of my favorite definitions comes from a recent publishing and one of my modern yoga teachers, Susanna Barkataki. In her book, she says, yoga has always been a science of liberation. It's a coherent method of personal freedom, social justice, and equity that has been tested over time and in practice. Though it has often been reduced to little more than just carrying around a yoga mat and rolling out to do a class where you move your body in different shapes, it's so much more. Yoga is a mind, body, and spiritual practice that invites deeper breath and presence through movement aligned with breath. It's a powerful practice and its potential for liberation is immense. I then ask, who deserves yoga? And I think Juvana Heyman from Accessible Yoga, another one of my teachers, has a really great answer in his recent book. Economic status, race, sexuality, gender identity, and ability can all limit access to opportunity. Although life can be challenging for everyone, our personal privilege will often predict how much money and physical comfort life brings. It will also limit access to quality healthcare and self-care practices like yoga. To practice yoga, you need access to yoga teachers and information about yoga. You need the time and the money to go to class, buy a book, get a subscription, an online service. You also need to believe yoga is an appropriate practice for you. Unfortunately, most yoga spaces are not welcoming to people with disabilities, fat students, or anyone who doesn't fit the commercial image of the yoga practitioner. How do we change this limited understanding of who can practice yoga? Well, he says we can start by exploring what yoga really is. And I hope through this conversation, this program, you clarify how you might respond with courageousness and steadfastness during this time, building relationships with others who share the same questions you do about how to create a just world. And key leaders and teachers, organizations have recognized the void and are actively creating yoga platforms based on social justice initiatives, advancing the realization of accessible and inclusive embodied practices for all. So how do we as scholar, practitioner, teacher, students engage in meaningful transformative yoga practice without contributing to industry established systemic oppression and reaffirming underlying foundations of neoliberal capitalism? If you were on watching the panel that we did earlier today, I mean, that was a thread line, and a lot of people are asking this question. I think acknowledging the need for unabashed focus on the cultivation of accessibility, diversity, and equity is super important for this to be move forward. So accessibility can be narrowly defined, but I like to widen the definition, a more comprehensive definition that employs the context of this discussion to widen the perspective and include the ability for all individuals, regardless of race or identity, to access and benefit from a system or entity, which in this case is yoga. So the access and the benefit to be received. I think a fun quote from everyone's favorite 80s PBS yoga teacher, but I think she recognized it even back then, that today's yoga can fit all ages, sizes, body shapes for the Olympic athlete, a hospital bed, a heated yoga studio, in a chair. Amazing, considering this practice probably began thousands of years ago in a cave. I think she's speaking to the adaptability of mainly asana, meditation, and maybe pranayama, but I see it as an example of how we should be thinking about our yoga practice and teaching. How can we as modern practitioners challenge ourselves to be more discerning about how we think, speak, and share yoga? Now, diversity is not necessarily about how we differ. Diversity is about embracing one another's uniqueness. It's the gathering of people with various lived identities, cultural backgrounds, and perspectives. And it's extremely important. Take a moment to consider, how do you want people to feel as they enter your yoga space or as they experience your yoga offering or your teachings? Notice who is being excluded from the practice at your studios or the classes that you attend. Who is not present in that yoga space or yoga room? Who's being included in the space? Who is the practice for? What might prohibit people of various backgrounds from feeling as if the space is safe for them or safe for them to begin a new practice? Who is being served by the studio or the practice space's mission, the vision? When someone enters this space, do they feel a resonance? Will they see themselves reflected in the physical environment, the teachers, the class offerings? Is the cost of the class prohibiting people from being able to practice in the space? Another aspect that is equity. redistributing resources and opportunities to achieve equal outcomes. This requires addressing disparities and disadvantages of different communities. So a fun meme that really helps exemplify this, because we often conflate equality with equity. Equality is giving everyone the same tools, the same ladder, if you will, providing the same opportunities to everyone without taking into consider the context of privilege and discrimination. Can you see how yoga studios might perpetuate this? Whereas we need equity. Equity is giving everyone the tools they need to be successful. So one might get a certain ladder, or a shorter ladder, or a taller ladder, depending on what they need. For us to reach equity, we have to find the solutions that really address the intersectional identities that we are all oppressed by through systemic oppression, racism, exploitation, etc. And to even take this analogy or this memification even further, when you look at reality, it's really the haves and the have-nots. Someone has a million boxes and can see the game, the baseball game in this the meme really well, and another person is dug so deep they can't even see the top of the fence. Equality assumes that everybody would need the same box to see the same game. Equity would give each individual the amount of boxes that they need. But really, justice is where we start to tear down and disrupt what is the system or the entity that is causing inequity, and addressing it full on. So I know this is quick, but contemplate your understanding of accessibility, equity. How can, and further still, how can you practice, teach, offer sacred spaces that really reflect actual implementation of these concepts in an effort to decrease harm? And a lot of what we're talking about really starts to centralize on how power works. And as we close out here, a definition I like to provide is for social location. And it's a practice used to reflect on the groups you belong to because of your place or position in history and society. It's a tool used to clearly see your proximity to power based on identities you embodied. And all of us have this social location that's defined by our intersectional identities. One's position in society is based on their social group membership that determines their proximity to power and privilege. So if we had longer, you can find this wheel of power and privilege on the web. It's adopted from ccrweb.ca. And it's just a real visceral way to think about power, privilege, and oppression. You can think about the circle as equaling culture, and the wheel as a tool to help us further our awareness of our intersectional identity and personal proximity to power. So if we are in a true long form workshop, I would have you work through this and take each of those pie slices and put a dot or a circle where you in this moment of your life find yourself, and then after you've completed the each pie piece, thinking about where all those circles or dots lie and what that means about your proximity to power or your proximity to marginalization. How does it make you feel? Did anything surprise you? And then also recognition that that is your wheel in this moment. What about in 10 years or, as an aging adult, right? Would you maybe obtain more formal education? Might your body size, your mental health, your wealth differ from at this point in your life? May your housing maybe differ, your ability. So all of these things these pie slices are part of culture, but they're also very much not a frozen moment in time. It's not a monolith. And really the purpose is to reflect on your social location and how you teach and hold space or converse and hold yourself in community in regards to the social location. How do you show up for social justice and exchange in the world, for liberation? For me, it is all about accountability. And one of my favorite quotes, if you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. So a reminder for white people needing to fight racism. And it's not to say everyone doesn't need to fight racism. It means those people that are closest in proximities to power, to systems that hold these oppressive, states. Those are the people that have the proximity to be able to put in the most work. So straight people fight homophobia, men fight misogyny, cisgender fight transphobia, able-bodied, neurotypical people fight ableism. Privilege needs to combat oppression. So there is so much more that I had planned to discuss with you all, but I'll leave it there for today. Just a reminder that how we might construct accountability in the ways in which we live our lives towards justice, accessibility, equity, and diversity. How might we use our intersectional identities and associated powers and privileges towards liberation of the collective? So I hope you can contemplate that in your journals and in your own time. And thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Taina Rodriguez Berardi. I'll drop my email and contact info in the chat. And with that, I will hand it off to Katie to get the party started.
Thank you so much, Taina.
You're welcome.